Welcome to Statistics Vocab, and today we're going to focus on observations, surveys, and experiments. So for the first do now question, in which of the following situations is the survey least likely to contain bias? Remember that bias comes into play if the people who you are asking definitely feel a certain way towards what you are asking. For example, the first one, surveying a sample of people leaving a concert about their favorite musicians. If you ask people leaving a particular concert about their favorite musicians, chances are their favorite musician is the concert they just went to. So that's definitely going to have bias. If you continue reading these questions, the one that is least likely to have any bias is choice 3, because everyone has to go to a grocery store, right? Everyone has to do it. So you're not really focusing in on what their political party affiliations are, right? If, for example, Republicans and Democrats, both of them have to go to the grocery store. So you're not going to get results leaning in one way or another. So who you're asking is separate from what their political party affiliations are, where it's not that biased. For the second one, Cheap and Fast Gas Station is conducting a consumer satisfaction survey. Which method of collecting data would most likely lead to a biased sample? So if you're looking for bias, you want the least random, because the less random it is, the more likely that you're going to get a particular response. So interviewing every 5th person to come into a station is pretty random, which means it wouldn't create that much of a bias. Interviewing customers chosen at random by a computer at the checkout is again random. I mean, it says random in the question, so does choice 4. Choice 3 is the only one that doesn't mention random, and if you think about it, interviewing customers who call an 800 number posted on the receipts. And think about the reasons why you might call in from a number on a receipt, right? Because most people don't do it. You're either calling in because you had an exceptionally great interaction at the gas station, which is pretty unlikely. Mainly, people are going to call in because they're really unhappy. So they're probably going to be calling in with all these stories about complaining. And that leads to the most biased results. So the reason why this is the most biased is because the people who are participating in this are selecting themselves. And anytime people are selecting themselves, it's going to create a bias because these people are going to have very strong opinions on what they feel. So let's go into the vocab for today. Now, you have 3 different ways of collecting data in order to make conclusions based on it. So the first way is an observational study, and that is when researchers simply collect data based on what is seen and heard and make inferences based on the data collected. Now, observational studies are designed to observe subjects as they are without any manipulation by the researcher. So what's really important about observational studies is that the person who's doing the observation is not interfering at all. They're not doing anything to these studies other than watching and taking notes. Now, surveys, the most common one that we know, is a type of observational study that gathers data by asking people a number of questions. So anytime you see the word questionnaire or you see questions, you should think this is a survey. It's a type of observational study. Now, the last one is an experiment. And that's when the researcher divides the subject into 2 groups using randomization and imposes different treatments on the groups. Sometimes a control group is present, Comparisons of results are made to determine the effect the treatment has on the subjects and to establish causation. So basically, the difference between observational studies and experiments are that experiments require you to change something. In order to make an experiment, you have to do something to one of the groups. So with observations, you can observe two groups and how they are different as long as you're not interfering with the setup. With experiments, you have two groups and one group has something that the other doesn't because you imposed it on them. So experiments, anytime you see cause and effect data, you should be thinking about experiments. Now, good experiments have three components. They have a treatment, which is the condition being imposed on the subjects that is being studied and investigated in an experiment. Ideally, we would like treatments to be randomly assigned, right? We don't want to have favoritism, and that's going to mess up the random results of the study. You also have a control group, which is a group used for comparison in order to conclude the effectiveness of a treatment. So basically, in your two groups, one group is going to get the treatment and the other one is not. The one that doesn't get the treatment is called your control group. Last one is a placebo, which you might have heard before. It's a pill that contains no active ingredient. It's called a dummy treatment used for the control group. So the most common experiments are science experiments when you're talking about medicine. And what they'll do is they'll create two groups of people, right? You'll have the treatment group and the control group. The only thing is that the treatment group is going to be getting the medicine to test the effectiveness of it. That's the treatment. Now, the control group, we don't want them to know that they're not getting the medicine. So instead, they usually get a placebo. So they think they're getting it, and that way you have two equal groups who both think that they're getting treatment, and then you'll see, well, the one that actually does get treatment, that's the effect the medicine has, and the one that got the fake treatment that they don't know about, that's the placebo. So let's look at questions that you're actually going to be asked about this. So your first one was on the regions. It was 2 points, and it was to describe how a controlled experiment can be created to examine the effect of ingredient X in a toothpaste. For these questions, you need to first explain how you're going to create your two groups, right? They said experiment, so you know you need two groups. So say that you're randomly creating two groups first. Really important that you mention the randomly part. Next, you want to say what one group is getting. So one group is going to be getting that toothpaste with the ingredient X, which would be your treatment. And the other group is going to have the toothpaste without ingredients X. Now remember that this other group is going to be your control group. And in this case, the toothpaste without the ingredient would kind of be the placebo because they're both getting toothpaste, but the control group doesn't know that they don't have the ingredient X in theirs. For the second one, I suggest that you pause the video, you go through these questions and see if you're getting the right answers from the answer key. And if you're not getting them, you can fast forward or take your time listening to all these explanations in the videos for any questions that you got wrong. But carrying on, which task is not a component of an observational study? So the researcher decides who will make up the sample. That is part of an observation. You get to decide who you want to observe. The researcher analyzes the data received from the sample. Also, you have to observe what you're actually watching. You have to make you have to make conclusions from what you're analyzing. And the next one is the researcher gathers data from the sample using surveys or taking measurements. Remember that surveys are a type of observational study, so that's okay. And you can take measurements too. That's not affecting what's actually going to happen. The last one, however, is the research divides the sample into two groups. That's okay. However, with one group acting as a control group, that only happens with experiments. Because that means you're doing something to one group that you're not doing to the control group, and that's why it's not part of an observational study. For number 3, a market research firm needs to collect data on viewer preferences for local news programming in Buffalo. Which method of data collection is most appropriate? So, in case you don't know what a census is, it's basically just something that you have to fill out for the government that tells them how many people are living at your home, and it's basically to let the government know more things about the population. That way they can allocate funding appropriately. So the census is not going to tell them anything about what type of TV you like to watch. If you're talking about a survey, observation, or controlled experiment, if you just want to know what type of TV they like to watch, I mean, you're not going to create an experiment based off of it. You're either going to ask the people or observe what they like. Now, an observation isn't really that appropriate for this because you're talking about everyone in Buffalo. And what are you going to do? Go and sit in their living room and watch what they're watching on TV? That's weird and creepy. That's not very appropriate for the situation. Instead, you're going to send out a survey. It's easiest to just ask all these people, what type of local news programming do you prefer? And that's going to be easiest. For choice 4, a doctor who wants to test the effectiveness of a new drug on her patients, she separates her sample of patients into two groups and administers the drug to only one of these groups. So you have two groups, but only one is getting something that the other isn't. Anytime one group is different than the other because one is getting something that the other isn't, we are talking about an experiment. For number 5, a school cafeteria has 5 different lunch periods. The cafeteria staff wants to find out which items on the menu are most popular, so they give every student in the first lunch period a list of questions to answer in order to collect data to represent the school. What type of study does this represent? You're giving them questions to answer. So automatically, if they have to answer a questionnaire, we're talking about surveys. The question is, are we talking about the sample or the population? And if you read carefully, which is required in statistics, you're only giving this survey the first lunch period, right? There's 5 different lunch periods. So this up here would be the population. However, you're only asking one. So in that case, you're asking the sample. Which statement about statistical analysis is false? And this was a Regents question. So your first one, experiments can suggest patterns and relationships in data. That is true. Those are the results you're getting. Experiments can determine cause and effects relationships. That is perfect because anytime you see cause and effect, you should be thinking experiments, because experiments, you're doing something to cause something to happen, and the effect is what happens from what you did. Observation studies can determine cause and effect relationships, or observation studies can suggest patterns and relations in data. With observations, you're not actually doing anything to the groups. You're only watching them. So in that case, there is no cause and effect relationship. You're not causing anything to happen. You're just watching. So that's why it's false. For number 7, which statement is not part of an observational study? The researcher decides who will participate in the sample group. You can do that. The researcher gathers data from the sample using surveys or measuring instruments. Again, that is fine. the researcher divides the sample into two groups, with one group being a control group, and the researcher analyzes the data obtained from the sample group. Again, observations, you're not doing anything, but if you have a control group, that means there is a group you are experimenting on with a treatment. So this one has to do with experiments, which means it is not part of an observation. For number 8, in which of the following cases would a survey be more appropriate than an experimental study? Now, for this one, if you read all of the responses, which one would be easiest to just ask them with a list of questions, right? Instead of performing an experiment? And the easiest one to send a questionnaire to would be a study to determine the most popular show on television on a given night. You can just ask people, which TV show do you like the most? You can't ask people how well this drug lowers your cholesterol. You have to actually test on them to see if the drug is lowering their cholesterol or not, and you'd have to create an experiment for that one to see, is the drug actually affecting it, or is their cholesterol just going up or down without the drug itself? For number 9, a researcher randomly divides 50 bean plants into two groups. Automatically, because he's creating two groups, we're not talking about surveys. We're talking about experiments or observations. Now, he puts one group by a window to receive natural light, and the second group under artificial light. He records the growths of the plants weekly, and which data collection method is described in the situation. So you have two different groups, and one of them is getting something that the other one isn't, which means one is a control group and one is a treatment group. So that is going to be a controlled experiment because your two groups are being treated differently. So for the next three, we're going to talk about if it's an observational study, an experiment, or a survey. The first one, a study investigated whether boys are quicker at learning video games than girls. 20 randomly selected boys and 20 randomly selected girls played a video game that they had never played before. The time it took them to reach a certain level of expertise was recorded. Now, in this one, you do have two groups. And yes, the groups are different. One is a group of boys, the other one is a group of girls. However, what they're observing in each one is the exact same thing. They are being given the same video game that neither of them have played before, and they're talking about reaching the same level. So one group doesn't have something that the other one doesn't, which means this is a basic observational study. And the reason is because there's no treatment or control group. They are just recording data. For number 11, as your statistics projects, you collect data by posting 5 questions on poster board around your classroom and record how your classmates respond to them. This one should be pretty obvious. You are asking questions. So this is going to be a survey. Because you're asking questions. It's pretty straightforward. And the last one, a study determines whether taking aspirin regularly helps to prevent heart attacks. A large group of male physicians of comparable health were randomly assigned equally to taking an aspirin every day or taking a placebo. After several years, the proportion of the study participants who had suffered heart attacks in each group was compared. So you have two groups, but in this case, one group is getting something that the other isn't. And you even see the word placebo here. So this is going to be an experiment. Because there's a treatment and a control group. So to sum it up, you have 3 main ways of collecting data. you have observational studies, in which you get to choose who you're observing and who your groups are and what you are observing, but you are not allowed to cause any effect on what is happening to them. All you can do is watch and record data. As a stem from that, you have surveys, which is a type of observational study where you are just asking questions, and that's how you're recording your data. So keywords for survey is questions or questionnaire. And the last one is an experiment. So keep in mind that you're talking about experiments when you have two groups and one group has something the other one does not. So keywords are going to be treatment. If you see the word control, or if you see the word placebo, or if you see any talk about cause and effect relationships, that is talking about an experiment, because you're actually doing something to cause it to happen. So those are your three types. Pay attention to the wording. It makes a ton of difference when reading these questions. And that's all for this video.